Pro Brick exclusive YouTube channel, and I'm going to talk on codependency. I'm Pro One Theologist. I have a channel called Pro One Theologist. I'm also Pro Bricky on Facebook, Pro Bricky Next Generation, where the next generation's taken over the page. Codependency for me was pretty well sorted out as a young bloke. I grew up in a family where my father was a womanizer because he was a jockey. He's a professional jockey. And they say it's the sport of kings. Well, ask the jockeys that. They seem to get the pick of the litter of the women. All the ladies in the stables and things, you can imagine it. And unfortunately, that didn't go well for my mother or with my mother, who left him at a very early stages in their marriage. We were only little babies at the time. And so we went from, I think it was Southport, they were living at Southport Racetrack, and my mother came back on a Greyhound bus to Barella, to her parents, never to speak with Victor again at that point. So I never knew my real father right up until my 30s, where I went and found him. Fortunately, he was still alive. And funnily enough, through several different life-changing circumstances and all the rest of it, he actually spent many, many hours with my mother before she died. And she forgave him, and he forgave her. I'll never forget the power of the Lord. There is a Lord. I knew when that happened there was a Lord. For all the pain and suffering that we grew up with, not knowing who for me, not knowing my father, and all the evil associated with the mystery behind that, and the way in which we grew up, and no identity, unable to learn, robbed of so many things because of the broken family. I know how all that works. But as a young fellow, we moved. Well, I spent my early days at Barella, living with my grandma and granddad. My mother was very ill with kidney problems. She spent 18 months in Auburn Hospital. And I can remember visiting this sick woman in this bed. I was afraid of her. Her name was Pauline, and that was my mum. She was terminally ill. She made it. But I never knew my mum as a young bloke. I just knew this poor woman that suffered illness and betrayal and sadness. Our grandmother and my grandfather, really good people, really. Granddad was an ex-naval stoker on the HMAS Canberra when it was blown in the side. There's some of the stories that he used to tell me. Poor old Granddad used to scream out of a night, and Grandma would have to shake him out of his sleep. They didn't sleep together, which was quite bizarre for me. I couldn't figure that out. And as little kids, we'd sleep with Grandma, and she'd always say the Lord's Prayer, believe it or not, and we'd say it with her. She'd say, Our Father, and we'd go, Our Father, etc. And we pass that on to our children as well, Janice and I. So we moved back to Barella and 33 3rd Avenue, Barella. And I think Mum lived in 31 or 35. They lived next door to each other. And this is all relative to codependence, because it was so disjointed and dysfunctional in my early childhood. I didn't know what dependence was. I didn't know who I was. When my mother finally come home to the place next door to Grandma's on 3rd Avenue at Barella, I didn't know who she was, and they used to send me over there to stay, and I'd scream and scream and scream and scream until they'd let me go back to Grandma's. I treated them like didn't know them and I was scared of my mum. And I remember my mum trying to date men and things like this, and she'd get left behind and this kind of stuff. But I'd be glad to say it was never because of my sister and myself. No, it wasn't. Unlike some of these children today who just completely undermine their mother's relationships. But one day I went next door and I was kicking the ball around. I was only 5 years old, kicking the ball around in the mother's backyard, all on my own, because I'd become one of these kids that could do things on his own. Like I'd try and catch birds, and it's only a young bloke, and ride me dinky and run up and down the street, get chased. I was a harness child. They'd have to keep me in a harness or I'd run away. Yeah, it was quite a strange childhood. I can remember just being alone or able to amuse myself, trying to catch sparrows. And I was only young, getting sent down to the shop to get the milk. Granddad would go down the shop actually and get the milk. And he made my legs strong because Granddad would walk all the way to these other shops and I'd go with him. And I can remember just becoming so tired, but he'd never pick me up. And he wasn't cruel, but he'd make me walk, and it made me strong. He taught me a lot, Granddad, a real lot. I was lucky to get to know him and be with him for all those years. Most of my life, he was a very special man. So, as time went by, my mother wanted us to be with her. And in the meantime, she met this Scotchman, John Morrison, from Glasgow. And she met him in the Burwood Hotel. And I think she was a bartender or something of this nature. And they fell in love, John and Pauline. But John was a drinker. I think she was at that stage in her life where that didn't matter. And as they smoked and all that. I don't think Mum didn't drink, but she smoked. And they had many years of happiness together. They had their quarrels and things like this, but when he came along, we were persuaded bit by bit to stay with Mum. And it still wasn't good. We used to cry a lot. We had a lot of trauma as children. I did. And I'd scream. I'd want to go back to my grandmother's. And what the strange part about it was, I wasn't bonded to my mother at all. And my bond was with my grandmother, which is misplaced. It was a misplaced maternal bond, as it were, and they couldn't change that attachment. Now, this is really important to understand about codependency. What happens with children and their mothers is this attachment takes place, and if the DNA father leaves the relationship or the marriage, everything falls out of harmony because children, there's something in the psyche and spirit of us that knows how to, it's like the missing cog gets put in place through a healthy family DNA unity. Like, it's really important for the parents that bring children in the world to stay together, because that union brings a formation into the child that otherwise wouldn't be there if they separate, if that makes sense. Well, I never had that. I never had that union to understand what the full power of it was. But I'd seen the full power of it later in life when I saw children flourishing, and it was because their mother and father was together. Original mother and father. There's definitely an unusual superpower that comes from a healthy family dynamic. So my early years were full of trauma, full of no identity, this strange sick woman, and there was this terrible fear and of not wanting to be there. And I can remember, and I'll close with this because I don't want this will be a series, but I don't want it to go too long. I can remember we'd get sent to my mother's place and put in the room, my sister and I can remember this vividly. There would be something under the bed. There would be something that was trying to pull us under the bed, and you wouldn't be able to speak and you wouldn't be able to scream. But when you broke out, when you finally got your voice out, you'd be hysterical and no one would understand what had just happened. And the fear of it all. I mean, I feared that bedroom because there was powers of darkness in there. I don't care if you don't believe me, I was there. That was harassing us and frightening us and physically moving us under the bed in a way in which was the trauma, the trauma that this demonic, what could you call it? Demonic abuse was causing was horrible, because as soon as somebody approached the room, it'd all disappear, and it'd seem like you were just a screaming child out of your brain. But that wasn't the case, and I didn't know what was going on. So there was a lot of serious stuff going on when we were little kids, and I don't forget it. I remember it. I remember it vividly. And I'll finish this first session at that. Please come back for the second session where we'll continue on codependency. This is Reverend Dr. Jason W. Morrison on the ProBrick exclusive YouTube channel. Bye for now.